How did Pythagoras influence Plato and the Neoplatonists? Why did the Pythagorean communities die out? How did Pythagoras and his followers find mystical truths in mathematics and music? Did mystics from faraway India influence the Pythagorean and Platonic beliefs on reincarnation? How similar were the Pythagorean communities to the early Christian monastic communities? And why did the Pythagoreans refuse to eat or touch beans? Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Let us learn and reflect together. At the end of our talk, we'll discuss the sources used for this video. Please feel free to follow along in the PowerPoint script we uploaded to SlideShare, which includes illustrations. Our sister blog includes footnotes, and both include our Amazon book links. Pythagoras, born in Ionia, which is the eastern Mediterranean coast of today's Turkey, was both a philosopher and a religious leader in the Greek settlements in southern Italy in the 6th century BC, several centuries before Plato. Iamblichus, in his Life of Pythagoras, calls him leader and father of divine philosophy, a god and demon, or supernatural being, or a divine man. As a young man, he may have studied under the Pre-Socratic philosopher Thales and other Ionian philosophers. Diogenes Laertius says he traveled abroad visiting the Chaldeans, the Magi, and the Egyptians, initiating himself into the Greek and barbarian mysteries, learning the ancient Coptic language. And he settled in Samos, Italy, when he was 40. Porphyry, in his Life of Pythagoras, says that his speech was so persuasive that in one address in Italy he made more than 2,000 adherents, founding a community. They received his ordinances and laws as divine precepts, and without them would do nothing. Indeed, they ranked him among the divinities. They held all property in common. Whenever they communicated to each other some choice bit of his philosophy from which physical truths could always be deduced, they would swear by the mystical number called the Tetractys, adjuring Pythagoras as a divine witness. Many followers of Pythagoras lived in religious communities, as did the followers of Orpheus. For the Pythagoreans, philosophy was a way of life. Both these two sects influenced each other and ancient culture, exactly how is hard to say. And the god Dionysius was worshipped in the Orphic cult. Frederick Copleston, in his History of Philosophy, notes that Orphic initiates were also taught the doctrine of the transmigration of souls, so that for them it is the soul and not the imprisoning body, which is the important part of man. Indeed, the soul is the real man, and it's not the mere shadow image of the body, as it appears in Homer. Robin Waterfield says that the elements of Orphism that the Pythagoreans adopted include the beliefs that the soul is imprisoned in the body until it has paid the penalty for past misdeeds. A life of ritual purity is required to cleanse our souls. And ascetic prescriptions for purity include abstention from blood sacrifice and from eating meat and most fish. And the poet Xenophanes penned a poem about Pythagoras. One day, passing a puppy being thrashed, Pythagoras pitied the whelp and cried out, "Stop, don't strike, for it is the soul of a dear man. I recognized him by his yelp." In a prior reflection by the Lutheran theologian Anders Nygren on Plato's Symposium, he posits that there's a connection between the Platonic concept of divine love, as described by Socrates' lady friend Diotima in the Dialogue, and Orphism, which was an ancient Greek religious belief surrounding the myth of Dionysus, according to the mythical poet Orpheus. Frederick Copleston says that the three ancient biographies of Pythagoras are all romances, but that is misleading. Diogenes of Laertius likely wrote the famous lives of eminent philosophies in the 3rd century AD. Diogenes is a valuable source for the Greek philosophers, and for many he's the only source. He prefers to repeat interesting vignettes and stories about their lives rather than present a coherent summary of their philosophy, and often is the only extant source. Although they were written later in the 4th century AD, the two versions of the Life of Pythagoras, written by the Neoplatonists Porphyry and Iamblichus, are more coherent, both as biographies and as summaries of their philosophies. And Porphyry is best known for writing down the teachers of the eminent Neoplatonist Plotinus, and his biography is much more succinct than the rambling, repetitive biography by Iamblichus. And we must not forget that these Neoplatonists had access to documents that are long lost to us in the modern world. Iamblichus says that Pythagoras' philosophy is primarily a moral philosophy that seeks, above all, to follow God, which is also the goal of the Stoic and Platonic philosophies that draw from this tradition. Iamblichus, Pythagoras advises us to arrange our whole life with a view to follow God. Because God exists and is the Lord of all things, it is universally acknowledged that good is to be requested of him. For all men do good to those whom they love, and to whom they are delighted. Thus, we must live a godly life in which God delights. Were the moral teachings of Pythagoras describing the type of henotheism that we see in the writings of the Greek and Roman Stoic philosophers? Like the Stoics, the Pythagorean works we review do not dwell on the myths of the god or refer to the various gods individually very often. Although the Pythagoreans often do refer to a singular god, or to the gods as a plural entity, they do not interchangeably speak of Zeus and God as the Stoics often do. Hence, this henotheism can be seen as an incipient monotheism. Although henotheism does not deny the existence of the pagan gods, they often speak of them as if they had one voice. Diogenes quotes Socrates. Pythagoras says that life resembles a festival where some go to compete for a prize, others to buy or sell, while the philosopher hunts for the truth. Iamblichus' Pythagoras says that some men are influenced by riches and luxury, others by love of power and domination, and others by an insane ambition for glory. But the most pure and unadulterated character is the man who gives himself to the contemplation of the most beautiful things, and to whom it is proper to call a philosopher. Pythagoras taught that the beautiful truth is that the gods are not the causes of evil, and that diseases and calamities of the body are the seed of intemperance, which is contrary to many myths. And Diogenes Pythagoras says that the soul of man is divided into three parts: mind, reason, and passion. Other animals have mind and passion, but man alone possesses reason. The Egyptians thought that the brain was unimportant and extracted it during an embalming, but Pythagoras disagreed. The soul's headquarters extend from the heart to the brain. The part that resides in the heart is passion, while reason and mind are located in the brain. Sensations are distilled from these. Reasoning is immortal, the others are mortal. The soul draws its nourishment from the blood, and the ratios of the soul are breaths. The soul and its faculties are invisible, just as the ether is invisible. Now, in Judeo-Christian tradition, we pray to God for guidance or seek advice from a priest, pastor, or rabbi. But instead, Iamblichus' Pythagoras encourages his disciple to consult someone who has heard God himself, or procures it through divine art. Hence, the Pythagoreans study the art of divination. Now, Pythagoras himself never sacrificed animals, but he permitted his followers to sacrifice animals, such as a cock or a lamb, or other such animal recently born, but never oxen. Would Pythagoras condone the examination of the entrails of sacrificed animals for messages from the gods, as was common in ancient Greece centuries later? Porphyry explains that Pythagoras instructed his disciples to speak well and think reverently of the gods, muses, and heroes, and likewise of parents and benefactors, that they should obey the laws, that they should not relegate the worship of the gods to a secondary position, performing it eagerly, even at home, that to the celestial divinities they should sacrifice uncommon offerings, and ordinary ones to the inferior deities. Now, as a defender of paganism against Christianity, Porphyry advises his fellow pagans to worship the gods as fervently as Christians pray, that sacrifices are not enough. But traditionally, in paganism, the proper form of sacrifice was more important than the devotional motives of the devotee. Diogenes Laertius cites the general principles of Pythagoras. He forbids us to pray for ourselves, since we do not know what is good for us. One should be moderate when drinking or eating, rejecting drunkenness. Sexual pleasure is harmful in every season and is not good for one's health. Now, Diogenes Pythagoras concludes that the most important aspect of human life is the power to persuade the soul towards good or evil. Men who acquire a good soul are blessed, but evil men are never at rest, nor can they keep to the narrow path. Justice is the force of an oath, which is why Zeus is called the god of oaths. Virtue is harmony and health and goodness in its entirety in God himself. And the universe is governed by the laws of harmony. Friendship is harmonious equality. Iamblichus explicitly states that Plato learned his concepts of justice as the first principle from the Pythagoreans. Pythagoras advises us that association with men introduces justice, but alienation and a contempt of the common man produces injustice. And he extends this to friendly animals, urging us so we should never injure nor slay nor eat any one of them, since they too have rational souls. Iamblichus' Pythagoras warns us that since want of riches sometimes compels many to act contrary to justice, it is wise to live within your means. He also cautions that insolence, luxury, and a contempt for the laws impels men to injustice. He counsels that luxury be outlawed and that men be compelled to live a temperate and manly life. He prescribed his followers to establish governments that pass benevolent laws to promote justice, as nothing is a greater evil than anarchy. He suggests that men can be compelled to respect justice through fear, or perhaps through judges, although he does not say how. Porphyry's Pythagoras advises us there are three kinds of things that deserve to be pursued and acquired: honorable and virtuous things, those that help us to live a godly life, and those that bring pleasures of the blameless, the solid and grave kind, but not the vulgar, intoxicating kinds. There are two types of pleasures, one that indulges the bellies and lusts by a profusion of wealth, which he compared to the murderous songs of the sirens, and the other kind that consists of things honest, just, and necessary to life, which are just as sweet as the first, without the need for repentance. In these pleasures he compared to the harmony of the muses. Pythagoras advises us not to make enemies of our friends, nor to make friends of our enemies. Regard nothing as your own. Safeguard the law, and make war on lawlessness, and don't destroy or injure plant life or any animal that does men no harm. He held that shame and discretion forbids indulgence in laughter or scowling. And we have an interesting reflection on whether Christians can laugh or joke, penned by St. Nicodemus, who famously compiled the Greek Philokalia. Although we don't totally agree with his advice, which was penned in a Greece surrounded by an overly strict Muslim culture, nevertheless it contains valid warnings of the spiritual dangers of mockery and satire. We can also question in hindsight whether Erasmus's use of satire and mockery in Praise of Folly, penned shortly before the Protestant Reformation, was beneficial or harmful to Christianity. Porphyry repeats many of the pithy sayings of Pythagoras, with his interpretation of their meaning. Do not poke the fire with a sword, which means that we ought not to excite a man full of fire and anger with a sharp language. Do not pluck a crown, which means we should not violate the laws, which are the crowns of cities. Do not eat the heart, which means we should not afflict ourselves with sorrows. And when starting a journey, do not turn back, which means that we should not regret this life when nearing our time of death. Do not walk in the public way, which means we should avoid the opinions of the multitude, adopting those of the learned and the few. And do not carry the images of gods in rings, which means that we should not reveal at once to the vulgar one's opinions about the gods or discourse about them. Porphyry's Pythagoras counsels that when we go to sleep, we should consider our past actions, and when we awake, we should review with care our future plans. He repeats to himself before he falls asleep, nor suffer sleep to close thine eyes, till thrice thy acts that day thou hast run over. How did I slip? What deeds? What duty have I left undone? On rising, Pythagoras repeats, when I wake, in order lay the actions to be done today. In many Stoic essays extol the heavenly pleasures of friendship and the qualities of a true friend. And Diogenes Pythagoras says that the possessions of the friends are common property, which was the practice of his followers, and that friendship is equality. Porphyry's Pythagoras loved his friends exceedingly, being the first to declare that the goods of friends are common, and that a friend was another self. While they were in good health, he always conversed with them, and if they were sick, he nursed them, and if they were afflicted in mind, he solaced them, some by incantations and by magic charms, and others by music. He had prepared songs for the diseases of the body, and by the singing of which he cured the sick. There were also some that made us oblivious to sorrow, and mitigated our anger, and destroyed our lust. And Iamblichus describes how Pythagoras ministered to the students who joined his musical and mathematical monastic school of philosophy. Pythagoras sought to heal the souls of his followers through soothing melodies played on lyres. Iamblichus says Pythagoras encourages young men to the cultivation of learning, saying it was absurd to judge reason to be the most laudable of all things, and yet spend little time studying, while they pay great attention to the body, which is like a depraved friend who rapidly fails, while erudition, like worthy and good men, endures until death, and for some procures immortal renown after death. And the Pythagorean monastic ascetic practices are surprisingly similar to the 7th century monastic practices of the early Egyptian desert monks, as described by St. John Climacus in his Ladder of Divine Ascent. And one difference is that the early Christians didn't emphasize the study of music and mathematics, of course. Though these early Christian communities did not emphasize intellectual studies, nevertheless all novices were expected to become literate so they could read the Psalter. Diogenes shares Pythagoras' instructions for purification, some of which resemble the ancient Jewish laws. Purity is obtained by cleansing, ablution, and sprinkling with lustral water, and by avoiding all contact with cadavers, women in childbirth, and all that defiles, and beans and eggs and other forbidden foods. Diogenes Pythagoras forbade the slaughter and eating of animals, since their souls also possess justice. His real reason for forbidding the consumption of sentient animals was to train and accustom men to be content with their diet, so they could live on the most easily procurable foodstuffs, spreading their table with uncooked food and drinking only water. Like later monasteries, his initiates are not full-fledged members of the community, but are probationers when they first join. He speaks of quinquennial silence, which must mean that the probationers must be silent for the first 5 years. They are not expected to share their property with the community until they are initiated as a full member. Like monks, they should be temperate in their behavior, avoiding anger and avarice. They are discouraged from sharing the order's rituals with outsiders. In evaluating his newly admitted probationers, Iamblichus' Pythagoras observed that they were able to refrain from speaking, whether they were modest, whether they were driven by immoderate passion or desire, and whether they were capable of learning and memorizing, as a good memory is synonymous with intelligence in an oral tradition when all written works had to be copied. Pythagoras evaluated whether they were obedient, whether they could follow what was said with rapidity and perspicuity, and whether they showed a certain love and temperance in their studies. He considered ferocity as hostile to such a mode of education. For impudence, shamelessness, intemperance, slothfulness, slowness in learning, unrestrained licentiousness, disgrace, and the like are characteristic of savage manners. Rather, he valued gentleness and mildness. Iamblichus' Pythagoras encouraged his students to learn how to become good leaders, equal in all things to citizens, surpassing them in nothing other than justice, which is a theme that Plato later adopts. Pythagoras also advises his students that they should never revile anyone, nor take vengeance on those who revile them. And he warns us, only a stupid man pays attention to the opinion of everyone, but it is also stupid to despise the opinion of everyone. Those young men who wish to be saved should listen to the opinions of their elders and of those who have lived well. No man should be allowed to do as he pleases, but should be obedient to the laws of a just government. The community members perform their tranquil morning walks alone, waiting to discuss their doctrines and disciplines later in the day. Although Pythagoras was himself a vegetarian, he did not forbid his disciples from eating the meat of animals that were noxious to the human race, which likely meant that they could only eat the meat of predatory animals. After all, an unfortunate relative may have been reincarnated as a cow or a goat, but if they are so objectionable that they were reincarnated as a wolf or a bear, then they were out of luck. For some reason, they did not eat fish. Those members who did not meet the ascetic or intellectual standards were expelled from the community. Like St. Francis of Assisi, Iamblichus' Pythagoras could reason with predatory beasts. He detained the Ionian bear, which had severely injured the inhabitants, and that having gently stroked it with his hands for a long time, he fed it with maize and acorn, and compelled it by an oath no longer to touch any living thing, and he dismissed it. And he also talked an ox out of eating beans, which is a foodstuff that the Pythagoreans avoided. Copleston notes, the religious ascetic ideas and practices of the Pythagoreans centered around purity and purification, and the doctrine of transmigration of souls. And the practice of silence, the influence of music, and the study of mathematics were all looked on as valuable aids in tending the soul. Aristotle, in his Metaphysics, observes that the Pythagoreans devoted themselves to mathematics, and they were the first to advance this study, and thought it contained the principles of all things. Aristotle says, since the Pythagoreans saw that the attributes and the ratios of the musical scales were expressible in numbers, and numbers seemed to be the first things in the whole of nature, then the whole heaven was like a musical scale and a number. Copleston notes, to the Pythagoreans, not only was the earth spherical, but it was not the center of the universe. The earth and the planets, along with the sun, orbited around the central fire or hearth of the universe, which was identified by the number 1. Porphyry notes that the Pythagoreans divided the world into opposite powers. The one was a better monad, light, right, equal, stable, and straight, while the other was an inferior duad, darkness, left, unequal, unstable, and unmovable. Neoplatonists also view the almighty, immovable God as the One, who perhaps corresponds to the Christian God the Father. The Pythagoreans attached a great mystical significance to the tetractys, a triangle of 10 points formed by ascending 1, 2, 3, and 4 points. The Pythagoreans coined a prayer addressed to tetractys. Bless us, divine number, you who generated gods and men. O holy, holy tetractys, you who contain the root and source of the eternally flowing creation. For the divine number begins with a profound, pure unity, until it comes to the holy four. Then it begets the mother of all, the all-comprising, all-bounding, the firstborn, the never-swerving, the never-tiring holy ten, the key-holder of all. The Pythagoreans saw the external world as expressions of numbers. 1 is a point, 2 is a line, 3 is a plane, and 4 is a surface, which corresponds with their notion of dimensions. The Pythagoreans also associated other aspects of life with numbers. Justice was assigned the number 4, in marriage 5, which is the sum of the even feminine number 2 and the odd masculine number 3. The number 4 also corresponds to the 4 seasons and to the ancient classical elements of air, fire, water, and earth. Also, the proof of the Pythagorean theorem is attributed to Pythagoreans, where a squared plus b squared equals c squared, where the square of the hypotenuse of a right triangle is equal to the sum of the squares of the other two sides. The lifeless, boring manner in which most of us learn mathematics in school blinds us to the true elegance of mathematics. A brief foray into the puzzling world of recreational mathematics will demonstrate how mathematics can truly give us a glimpse into the mysterious cosmos that pervades our reality. And we also discover that our favorite translator and commentator, Robin Waterfield, translated Iamblichus' work on the theology of arithmetic. Now we're curious why Robin Waterfield was curious about this rather arcane work. Perhaps it is an ancient version of Martin Gardner's annotated Alice in Wonderland. And if we find this interesting, we'll cut a video on this sometime in 2025. And we decided to reflect on how Pythagoras influenced Platonism after we reflected on the Platonic dialogue of Meno, where Socrates led a slave boy into mathematically proving a simple geometry problem, ostensibly proving that knowledge can be remembered from a prior life. And in conclusion, how did the Pythagoreans influence Plato? Copleston observes that the Pythagoreans were certainly impressed by the importance of the soul and its right tendance, and was one of the most cherished convictions of Plato, to which he clung all his life. Plato was strongly influenced by the mathematical speculations of the Pythagoreans. In addition, Iamblichus specifically states that Plato adopted Pythagoras' principal concern for justice. And now we'll discuss the sources we used for this video. Before I researched this topic, I was under the impression that reliable sources on Pythagorean philosophy were scanty, but I was surprised by their depth. These ancient sources have their problems, as is typical, but they credibly describe in detail what life was like in a Pythagorean monastic community. And whenever possible, you should read the original works before drawing conclusions. Remember that when you read works penned by later historians or philosophers, you often learn more about them and their worldview than the history of philosophy they are depicting, which is why I prefer to heavily quote from the sources. It is true that few, if any, writings written by Pythagoras have survived. None of his works listed by Diogenes Laertius have survived. Like Socrates, he may not have written down his teachings, relying on his disciples to transmit his knowledge. But we do know that Pythagoras had many enthusiastic disciples who spread his philosophy, quoting memories of what their beloved master taught them centuries before Plato. These later works could include quotations from Pythagoras, but we just do not know. Pythagorean philosophy also deeply influenced Plato, as he also believed in the transmigration of souls or reincarnation, and Socrates also adopted the ascetic attitudes of the Pythagoreans. There were many Neoplatonist philosophers who called themselves Pythagoreans. But why did the old Pythagorean schools die out long before the lifetimes of Socrates and Plato? The Neoplatonist Porphyry himself speculates. Pythagorean philosophy was enigmatic. The commentaries were written in Doric, an obscure Greek dialect. These Doric writings were not fully understood, were misapprehended, and some were spurious. The Pythagoreans affirmed that Plato, Aristotle, and other philosophers appropriated the best of them, making but minor changes. Copleston glibly dismisses our three ancient biographies of Pythagoras as mere romance, one by Diogenes of Laertius and the other by the Neoplatonist Porphyry Iamblichus, who both used Diogenes as a source. Certainly these works have problems, but the fact that these Neoplatonists were more interested in penning a moral hagiography of Pythagoras than an historical biography doesn't discredit their efforts. But even with these problems, these Neoplatonist biographies include far too many historical details of the practices and the rules of the Pythagorean communities to be deemed unreliable. Indeed, our Neoplatonists relied on now lost works by several of Aristotle's students, and they likely drew from original Pythagorean sources now lost. In addition, there exist numerous moral essays by other Neoplatonist Pythagoreans. And we purchased Diogenes Laertius' Lives of Eminent Philosophers because it has many excellent footnotes. Plus, half the book has many interesting scholarly essays on Diogenes and the ancient philosophers. You can purchase the Neoplatonist biographies of Pythagoras for a reasonable price, or you can access the books scanned in that are accessible on the internet. Although these biographies describe how Pythagoras quickly gained many adherents in many communities, positively influencing the various city-states to govern justly, they also describe the intense political opposition his adherents faced. Pythagoras died an old man, and in one account that Diogenes cites, he died a peaceful death, but in another account he did not. It is undeniable that these Neoplatonists sought to bolster the pagan cause in an increasingly Christian world. Several miracle stories from Iamblichus mirror similar New Testament accounts, such as when a poisonous snake bit Pythagoras, but he bit back, killing the snake, and when witnesses heard a voice boom from above, "Hail Pythagoras." We also have book and lecture reviews on Greek history and philosophy. One of the more fantastic stories was when the tyrant Dionysius became angry when he could not befriend a group of traveling Pythagoreans. Dionysius dispatched 30 soldiers to fetch them. One couple was unable to keep up, straggling behind. Seeing the pursuing soldiers, the Pythagoreans determined that the precepts of their order permitted them to flee. But they encountered a field of beans. And since Pythagoreans should not even touch, let alone eat, beans, they halted, where they were slaughtered by the soldiers. The soldiers then remembered that their boss wanted them to bring back the Pythagoreans alive, so they brought these 2 straggling Pythagoreans, Melius and his pregnant wife, Timicca, before the tyrant Dionysius. He offered to allow the couple to administer his kingdom. They refused, so the tyrant queried if he could pose a question instead, and they agreed. So he asked them, "Why did your companions avoid the field of beans?" Now, since Pythagoreans are not permitted to divulge information about their sex rituals to outsiders, this upset the pregnant Timicca so much that she bit off her tongue and spat it out at the tyrant. And the stated morals of the story is that it is challenging to keep your tongue in check, and that sometimes bad things happen to those with pure intellects. And why do the Pythagoreans abstain from beans? Aristotle speculates that this is because beans resemble the genitals in shape, or because they, having no joints, resemble the gates of Hades, or perhaps they ruin the constitution. We presume through flatulence, or because they are oligarchic, since they are used to elect magistrates by lot. And Porphyry speculates that a bean plant, when sprouting, resembles the head of an infant. What we do know for sure is that the pregnant Timicca never revealed the secret behind the beans. The YouTube description includes a link to our PowerPoint script that we uploaded to SlideShare and also our blog. Please support this channel by sharing this video with your friends and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a very small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. Plus, we will host special discussion groups for our patrons. Plus, you can click on the Meetup or small M icon to participate in our online discussions, where we practice our future YouTube scripts. And please click on the links for other videos that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul.